America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Elaine Parker, the president of the Job Creators Network Foundation. And today we're joined by Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is the president and chief economist at ALEC, which stands for the American Legislative Exchange Council. And you can follow him on X at Tax Economists. Jonathan, welcome back to Main Street Matters.
Well, thank you, Elaine, for having me back on the show. It's always good to be with you and talking about some of the big policy issues of the day.
Yeah, there's really no shortage of things to talk about, is there?
No, it's been DC or in the States. I mean, the States go at warp speed every single year, which we all know, and that's why we love leading on some of the state issues at ALEC and working with you all at Job Creators Network. But the federal government, we thought we knew what Operation Warp Speed was, and then the second Trump administration here has proven us wrong, that we didn't know how fast things could move. And whether it's DOGE or so many of the efforts that the Trump administration is leading right now, is just so many things happening here in Washington as well. So it's nice to see Washington finally meet the pace of what's gone on in the States for decades.
Yes, moving at the speed of business finally, right?
That's right. Almost, yes.
Well, I want to start out talking to you about your new report that just came out. This is your 18th year of Rich States, Poor States ranking. Tell us about that. You just released it on Tax Day, which is very fitting, of course.
Yes, it was out in Salt Lake City, where we released the 18th edition of Rich States, Poor States with Governor Cox and Senate President Stuart Adams and Speaker Schultz. And Utah, the reason we were there, you're number one for 18 years in a row. We get to host a release, and it's an incredible opportunity to be out there with those legislative leaders and share the ALEC ideas that have helped make Utah the fastest growing state in America, not just by our metrics, but when you look at all the other metrics, state GDP, or income growth by state, or even population growth, Utah is number one in all of those categories over the last decade. And so we think there's a lot of connection there when you get it right on free market, pro-business, common sense, really, at the end of the day, public policy like Utah has. The results are coming right after, right? I mean, we see that, and that's been to the great benefit of Utahns across the board. And so we are so happy to be out there with those legislative leaders to really showcase the Utah success story, and hope that not just the rest of the states, but Washington, D.C. Can learn a little bit from what's been going right so many years now in Utah.
Well, that's great. Tell us, sort of top line, what are the things that are going so well in Utah that makes it continue to sort of win that top spot? And maybe what are some of the second and third place winners? Who are they, and what are some of their top attributes?
Yeah, we could probably spend the entire show talking about Utah and its successes. And it's just an incredible top to bottom success story, I think, in so many ways. And from a top tier kind of top line perspective of it, I think it's because of commitment for so many years from legislative leaders like the ones I talked about a minute ago, that are continually looking to improve, to say, we know we have this competitive 50 laboratories of democracy. We're in direct competition with not just our neighboring states, but states all across the country for businesses and jobs and for Americans voting with their feet. One of our key findings in Rich States, Poor States, from state to state, this great movement of people and capital from state to state. And Utah's been a big winner. And the legislative leaders realize that, and they're doubling down on their successes and not being complacent. I think that's like I said, from a macro perspective, that's one of the keys to the Utah success before you get into all the nitty gritty of the various policies and successes that they've seen there. One example to just prove that point and drive it home is our team looked back to the first edition of Rich States, Poor States coming out in 2007. And Utah was number one. and they had just enacted the flat tax, one of the great things that they've done. And now we've seen, a good number of states, I think 7 states now have become flat tax states in that period of time. But Utah was the very first in recent memory. And if Utah would have just rested on its laurels in 2007 and said, hey, we're the number one state in America, we have a very good makeup, we don't need to do anything else, we looked at the numbers and we found that Utah today would be ranked 23rd in economic outlook in rich states, poor states, not by doing anything bad, but just by falling behind by standing still. It's a key message that we find time and time again, that states don't make continuous progress, fall behind as all the other states pass them by. So I think that is one of the key takeaways from my mind from Utah. And then the other, when you look at the policy makeup, Utah's been forward looking in so many ways. One was pension reform. We've talked, I know, Elaine, a lot over the years about Illinois and New Jersey and all these states that have just gotten billions of dollars of these unfunded pension liabilities for the public pension plans for workers in state and local government. That's a major future tax increase waiting to happen for businesses and for individuals in those states. Utah thought about this. They saw the problems from the great financial crisis. And they looked ahead around the curve to say, what does the private sector do here? And well, it turns out, as you know well, I'm sure most of the Job Creators Network members long ago, because they follow actual accounting standards, have transitioned new hires over time into flexible 401k style retirement plans that you have and match. But at the end of the day, the workers are allowed to be flexible where they'd like to take their retirement nest egg from job to job. And in the cases of states, that avoids building up these massive unfunded liabilities. So Utah did that over a decade ago. It saved them countless billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities that other states have seen. But then they look at things like Utah's addressed property taxes. We go around the states, and I've probably been in about 35 states in the last year. And as I ask state legislators, what are you hearing from your constituents is their number one challenge? In almost everywhere where I've been, the number one challenge we hear is property tax burdens, Elaine. And that is true not just for residential, but certainly for commercial and for business owners as well. Small businesses across the board are really getting hit by the assessment-driven property tax problem in cities and counties across the country. And Utah, this goes back almost 40 years ago with what they call their truth in taxation model on property taxes that we've adopted as ALEC model policy that really puts some transparency and accountability and holds the feet to the fire, really, of local elected officials. And if you spend too much, then you're going to at least have to take the recorded votes and say, we're going to tax more of your property. Where in so many other cases, it becomes a quagmire where really nobody understands where property tax burdens are coming from. And Utah has gotten ahead of that curve. And the final thing I'll mention, we could, like I said, go on and on about Utah, is when we're talking about right now this whole relationship between Washington and the states and the needed, I think, reset of all these federal funds that President Biden sent out to the states. They were sloshing around in state budgets. It's one of the reasons states had a lot of money sitting in those budgets, because it was these federal funds. We all know that there's no such thing as a free lunch, as the great Milton Friedman always reminded us. And those funds came with a lot of federal requirements and strings attached to them. And one of the things that Utah did a number of years ago now is really come up with a great system of cataloging what is it the state of Utah gets from the federal government and what are the costs associated with those federal funds that come into the state. And they don't stop there. They say, if the federal government decides to reduce its aid to Utah, what's our contingency plan to put in place, whether it's a 5% or 10% or 20% reduction, let's say, in a hypothetical scenario. They actually have a contingency plan to say, here's what we would do with those government programs, whether we would pick them up at the state level, or we'd ask maybe churches and synagogues and civic society organizations to pick up some of those functions, or whatever the case may be. The bond rating agencies have looked at this, and it's one of the reasons why Utah has consistently kept a AAA bond rating, is they actually have a plan in place if and when the federal government reduces aid to the states. And looking at the National Debt Clock website, if you ever want to feel pessimistic about your day, Elaine, go to that website and you see we're well above $36 trillion now of national debt. It's not really a question of if, it's when the federal government reduces aid to the states. And states like Utah, because of this forethought, are not just one step ahead, but a whole lot of steps ahead the other states.
So, you mentioned a couple things that make me obviously want to do some compare and contrast because of the state I live in, which is Florida. How many state governments have you seen move to away from the state pensions to the 401ks?
Well, it's been slow but steady progress. My home state of Michigan, under then Governor John Engler in the 90s, was one of the first states to really transition new hires into that 401k style retirement system. And that saved Michigan untold billions of dollars now in unfunded liabilities. Then you had other states like Utah that moved in that direction. We saw Oklahoma also move in that direction. Most recently, Arizona and North Dakota. But it's one that is a heavy political lift. Oftentimes, it gets misrepresented in the media as to what these reforms are looking to do, and it gets painted as being something that it's not. Because at the end of the day, it's actually pro-worker to do that. Because when you analyze where, let's say, Gen Z folks coming into the workforce or millennials before them, they don't work one job. I know this won't shock anybody watching this. They aren't going to work one job like their parents or their grandparents' generation for 40 years. They're going to have probably 10 jobs in the first 10 or 20 years of their careers, and looking at some of the averages. And so when you look at the way that states set up these pension systems, the young workers don't even invest into the pension system unless they've worked for that state government for, let's say, 5 or 8 or maybe even 10 years. And so it does them no good to be in this very expensive and very burdensome defined benefit system. It actually is very beneficial to the young workers, but oftentimes it doesn't get portrayed that way by the liberal media, as I'm sure won't shock you. And so it has been a little bit of a slow but steady progress in the states, but it's something that states absolutely need to look at because it's been obviously a shaky number of weeks here in the stock market. It's not just our plans that have been going up and down. Where do you think states invest their money when it comes to state pension systems? It's been a rocky road for state investments as well. And who's at the end of the day on the hook at the state level? Look around the room. It's taxpayers that are going to be on the hook if those state investments don't perform like their benchmarks suggest. And so that's a huge area. It's one that is not gotten nearly enough attention, but it needs to.
And just broadly speaking, what are some of the other key highlights you saw from some, maybe the top 5 states in general?
So looking at the top 5 in rich states, poor states, coming in right after Utah was Tennessee. There's a lot to like about what Tennessee has done. I know JCN and Alec, we partnered a ton on our Education Freedom Alliance with the huge school choice victory signed into law by Governor Lee and by legislators leading the way on that. That was a huge win. But beyond that, tax cuts and debt reduction in Tennessee catapulted them 10 full spots this year from number 12 to number 2 for economic outlook. So that's a great story and a victory in itself. And then you have a kind of a steady state in terms of Indiana that's been in the top 5 for a number of years, clocking in at number 3, North Carolina and North Dakota at 4 and 5. There's a really interesting story here about North Carolina in that you go back to the first edition of Rich States, Poor States, or in the early years before Tom Tillis was Speaker of the House. Now, of course, U.S. Senator Tom Tillis. You had a situation where North Carolina was middle of the pack. I think they bottomed out at number 26 in our ranking back pre-tax reform. And then you had Speaker Tillis, who served on the ALEC Board of Directors, and some great legislators come in, Governor Pat McCrory, and they remade the state's tax code. And it was a long progress that is continuing to be made right now in North Carolina. And they've not only kept up with other states, they have really stampeded into the top 10 and now into the top 5 in the index. And one of the things that people don't realize, even very observant folks that follow policy issues, but in current law, the income tax in North Carolina has been getting phased down. It became a flat tax as part of this tax reform that we've been talking about. But the corporate income tax, another huge attribute, and one of the things we measure in rich states, poor states for how competitive a state is, the corporate income tax in North Carolina in the next several years, by the end of this decade, will actually continue to phase down and be zero. So they will be the first state in recent memory that has eliminated its corporate income tax altogether without replacing it with another business tax. So it's a state that's seen some huge benefits from the personal rate reductions and eliminating the death tax and so many great things that they've done. But in current law, just in a few years, they will completely eliminate that business income tax. And talk about a way to put a billboard up on your state line saying we are open for business. That is what it is. It's not going to need to be these economic development incentive packages that states all across the country, of course, do and try to chase companies that way. It's going to be the free market way to bring companies into North Carolina, as we've seen over years. I expect that to accelerate after this reform is fully phased in.
Who was in the, like, say, bottom five? And I'm curious if you get pushback from those states when you issue these reports.
Well, we do. And it depends on who you ask sometimes, right? There will be those that say, well, we've been saying this for years. And I'm glad another organization comes in and says that we've ranked dead last. So I was in Albany, New York just a couple of weeks ago. Doing a press conference there with our ALEC delegation. And they have been beleaguered, right? And said, we've been jumping up and down trying to tell people how bad our business environment is, how high the tax burden is in New York. And of course, many of our members are in the minority there in New York and have been for a number of years and have a left-wing trifecta right now in Albany that really the question is, not if they're going to raise taxes generally, it's about which taxes they're going to raise. And New York and California and Illinois and the states that continue to be in the bottom of our ranking kind of follow that warning from Ronald Reagan that he always said, the liberal view of the economy can be summed up as this: if it moves, tax it; if it keeps moving, regulate it; if it stops moving, subsidize it. And that's what we see generally in the states with the highest tax rates, is then the way they go about competing is by going and actually doing special favorites to, special privilege to one industry over another or one company over another. And that may be one way in a short term to attract companies or industries, but it's not going to be a long-term way or path to success. And so New York is 50th out of 50, and they've been that way for 16 out of the 18 editions of Rich States, Poor States. And just beyond them as Bernie Sanders, Vermont, in number 49. And that won't be a surprise, I'm sure, to anybody that has followed policy in the Northeast. And then you have New Jersey, California, and Illinois. Once again, no surprises there. States that have continued to raise taxes, even during the pandemic. New Jersey was a state that came out under Governor Murphy and said, we're going to raise taxes. We have a budget shortfall. And of course, that precipitated even more individuals voting with their feet, more businesses moving out of New Jersey.
So when they call and say, I disagree with this, what do? Just pull out the data and say, well, take a look. Here's how we measured you. I mean, is that the kind of conversation that you have when they're pushing back?
Yeah, and it's pretty common sense, right? I mean, the things we look at, we chose the 15 variables that we look at in rich states, poor states. Things like taxes and regulation, labor policies, levels of state debt, state spending. So Art Laffer and Steve Moore, my co-authors of the report, Art Laffer studied this for 50 plus years and really narrowed down. Well, you could measure, literally 1,000 different things that, make some states rich and some states poor, but focusing on these 15 for a few reasons. As in Dr. Laffer's research, these are 15 of the most important variables for determining why some states grow and some states don't. But they're also things that state legislators directly control, whether it's in Albany or in Lansing or Richmond or Nashville. And that's an important element because there's lots of different ways that states get ranked these days, and some have very little or nothing to do with what state legislators control. And so getting back to the data point that you say, what do you do about the critics out there, is, we come into a state not because we have a horse in the race, but because we have a consistent way of measuring states based on proven policies that matter and actually drive growth. Based on, we know, as we talk to business owners, these are some of the important things they look at as they're looking at multiple state opportunities to either grow or move their business. We know based on many of the academic studies that these are determinants of where individuals and businesses will relocate or upsize their operations in some state versus others. And then, of course, you come back to the common sense element of it. When you raise taxes in location A and lower them in location B, you're going to have people leaving location A and going to location B, because people don't work for the privilege of paying taxes. They work for after-tax income. And when states realize that, whether it's, let's say in California, where their top income tax rate is over 13%, next door, you have Nevada, where they're one of the 9 states without a personal income tax. And we shouldn't be surprised when California, year after year after year, is losing population to Nevada and other lower tax states. It's common sense. It's not rocket surgery, as my co-author Art Lapper likes to say.
Exactly. I don't understand why liberals never understand that. They just think they can just keep raising taxes, every time they want to spend more money, instead of looking at where they can cut and maybe, redeploy resources differently. It's just they don't want to cut anything. I mean, look what's happening with Doge at the federal level. I mean, Doge isn't even really cutting anything. They're recommending, they're uncovering waste, fraud, and abuse, and they're making recommendations. And you would think that the sky is falling. I mean, they don't want to, there's nothing that isn't sacred in their spending library on things that they're doing, even when it gets tremendous media on the ridiculousness of some of these programs. It's crazy. And in the one hand, you'll see, an article about a company that has to, a major corporation that's making some layoffs because, they've got some cutbacks, or, the economy isn't working as well for them, or whatever the reason is. And, Doge is saying, hey, we've got, this entire building that no one comes to work at. So clearly we don't need them. And they say, oh, well, we have to cut back too because the government's not taking in enough money. I mean, the economics of life apply to the federal government and taxpayer dollars as much as they do to, a private company in the private sector. And so those employees experience the same kind of uncertainty, that kind of uncertainty all the time. But it's as if we are, it's unheard of that we would actually look at trying to find efficiencies within the government. And the liberals are just, I mean, literally, you would think that the sky is falling on them.
Yeah, you make such a great point there, in that, we have this system of really Washington, D.C. operating in a land of make believe, right? They have this Federal Reserve. They have the unlimited ability to, print. I guess they don't even print anymore. In a lot of cases, they just can quantitatively ease their way out and just increase the money supply. And of course, that's one of the things that we're still suffering the hangover effects from the Biden era, of this massive run up in government spending and debt, and the money supply run up, where has driven inflation. And that's the life that DC spenders can live, and that's a bipartisan problem, and it has been for a very long time. And I will say, like on the Doge effort, such a key effort to begin to uncover some of this. It's been layered on top of layer and top of layer for not just years, but decades, where people don't even look at the layers anymore. They just are talking about the marginal change of whether we're growing spending by 1% or 10% or 5%. And it's always just an argument over degree of how much government should grow, versus asking the fundamental question, which is what President Trump and Elon Musk and many of the members of this administration and Congress are now asking, which is, should it be done in the first place? And if so, who should do it? Should it be the federal government? Should it be state? Should it be people? Should it be charitable organizations and civic organizations? Just around the discussion right now in every single state. So 49 of the 50 states, Elaine, I'm sure you know this, they have balanced budget requirements in the state constitution or in state law. And in many states, that is the one thing they're required to do in a given state legislative session, is pass a balanced budget. Washington, D.C. doesn't even go through the charade of passing a budget, let alone a balanced budget, and haven't for many, many years. I mean, you have to go back to the time of Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House with the Republican Revolution in the 1990s, when you had consistent balanced budgets. And so, I mean, I think, when Americans get cynical about Washington, about this run up in federal debt and the inflation and all the things that we face, this is one of the reasons why. And so the fact that President Trump is bringing this common sense approach to budgeting, and at least having the discussions, whether, many of these are ended up being organizational kind of moves or long term, or their recommendations. And obviously Congress has to come in and make many of these decisions themselves. This is a needed conversation to have nationally, because if you look at the run up in the national debt, like we talked about the pessimism by looking at the national debt clock there a second ago, Think about the history of this for a second. Many of you know this as you're watching. Maybe don't. When you look at, we're looking forward here just in a little over a year, celebrating America's 250th birthday from the Declaration of Independence in 1776. An incredible, ability for us now to look back and do a little bit of just soul searching as a country. If you go back to the founding of America to 1980, when Ronald Reagan became president, that took the entire period of time of over 200 years for America to rack up its first $1 trillion, Elaine, of national debt. 1776 to 1980, roughly in that period, that took the entire time for 1 trillion. 1980 to the present, another 35 trillion have been added to the national debt. Trillions just in the last several years, right? I mean, so we're talking about this trajectory that's unsustainable. So I think as people think through it from a historic context of what this means for the future of America, for our kids, for our grandkids, even for national security, now at this point where we have so much of our national income from our taxpayers now going just to pay the interest on the debt, over $1 trillion a year, which is more than we're spending on our Department of Defense and military readiness across the board, now is being eaten up by interest costs. Think about that for a second. This is a huge problem. And I think Americans, whether they agree or disagree maybe with some of the policy areas that are being considered for reduction, just the fact that we're having this honest dialogue and conversation again as a country, I think everyone can be very thankful that we have leaders that are willing to take on this massive challenge.
Well, you mentioned, how we're at a point where we just argue over degrees of or percentages of increase in government spending because it goes up every year. It's just a matter of one side's arguing for, 2 or 3% and one side's arguing for only 1%. But as soon as the conversation turns to, well, let's go back to pre-COVID spending because COVID isn't here, we don't need those programs. Again, you would think that, we had taken someone's left leg off. It's incredible that we can't go back to at least pre-COVID spending levels when we don't have a pandemic. We literally are still spending at COVID levels. And we don't have a pandemic. So what are we spending the money on? What are we printing it for? Why is this happening? And the American people, I don't think that they understand those kinds of spending issues. And so when DOGE comes in and there's such pushback, and they're talking about we're going to cut Social Security and they're in the computers and they're getting our data and all this stuff. That's not what they're there for. I mean, it's ridiculous that we can't even look at how to cut spending. I mean, we've heard Democrat presidents over the time, Clinton, Obama, all of them talk about cutting spending and getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. Why is that a partisan issue now?
It's a great point. It shouldn't be. There's no reason this needs to be a partisan issue. It should be a common sense issue. We've racked up the credit cards far too long. And what would any responsible parent tell their kids if they're overspending? Is they, say, hey, maybe it's time to take a break of the credit card. We're going to cut that up, and we're going to teach some basic budgeting 101. And this is a great way where Washington can learn a thing or two from how the states go about doing that every single year. Not the fact that states get it perfect every year. Obviously, some states overspend, even in that kind of a environment. But by and large, the state leaders, the ALEC men and women across the country that we work with every single day, they go into that and they sharpen the pencils. And every single year they say, where can we find those savings? Because at the end of the day, states need to compete with each other. We were talking about with the Rich States, Poor States report, they realize they need to continue to use those savings to buy down tax rates and continue in this race for where jobs are created across the United States. That adds, I think, an element. And that's why I think in our American experiment, the founders were so prescient to think about this, to say states are going to be these laboratories of democracy. They're going to be essentially a free trade zone across these states. They're going to need to compete. But that keeps them honest, right? And the federal government doesn't have that. And when you have that combined with the Federal Reserve and the income tax and so many other things that the federal government has at its disposal, it's really not a fair playing field for taxpayers. And that's why, having these discussions, whether it's DOGE or, people like Rand Paul, who have been talking about a ideas for government spending reduction for many, many years. It used to be the penny plan that he proposed. Now, because of the way that national debt and spending is ramped up, I think it's up to 6 pennies. But the idea is all you need to do is shave 6 pennies off of every dollar of spending. We'd have we'd have the deficit under control right away. Right? And we'd begin to chip down on the national debt. Or to your point, Elaine, you just go back to pre-pandemic spending levels, and all of a sudden that raises a massive chunk of our problem when it comes to the deficit and debt issues here in Washington. But part of the reason I think we see so much pushback, obviously there's some emotional impact of friends or family that are affected by some of these positions being changed in Washington. So that's a human consideration, clearly. But I think some of this is the liberal media, right? They do not want anyone looking under the hood at what's going on with the massive amounts of government spending here in Washington. And they want to make a very painful example of Elon Musk and others that are trying to do the right thing and look for government waste and fraud and abuse, or even unauthorized congressional programs that have expired their even authorization to exist. If it was that important, maybe Congress should just authorize the programs. It's just kind of a thought that it comes to us from some common sense, I think, at the state level. But I do think that's what's going on here is any of the folks that are defenders of the big government status quo in Washington are looking to make an example of those coming after the waste, fraud, and abuse.
Absolutely. Well, where can people go to find your new report, Rich States, Poor States?
Well, you can go to alec.org, but you can also go to richstatespoorstates.org. And richstatespoorstates.org is a great clearinghouse of not just this year's report, but all 18 editions are loaded in. And it's a great way to explore where your state is today and how it has ranked every single year going back to 2007. And the other thing that's a great tool in that website on richstatespoorstates.org, Elaine, is we allow policymakers and anyone who visits the website to adjust their state's policies. And you can click on a button and say, I want to make my state a right to work state, or I want to eliminate my state income tax. What would that do to my rich states, poor states economic outlook score? So it's a great way for those that are following the developments in their state capitals or in touch with their policymakers, or if they're a policymaker and sitting in a committee hearing or on the chamber of their legislative body and saying, hey, there's a proposal that's going to do all these great things, or maybe bad proposals, and you can generate that to say that's going to move us in the wrong direction or in the right direction in the ranking. So it's a great way to use this in a real-time sense and actually see what policies would do to impact your ranking.
Jonathan, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network, and new episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. You can subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we'll be back soon with another episode. Bye for now.